Idaho Territory, late spring of 1874. The sky was wide and cloudless when he first saw her, kneeling at the edge of a quiet creek that ran between two cottonwoods, her dress soaked through the hem and her shoulders shaking. Matthew Vance had been riding along the waterline, boots damp from crossing the shallows, his horse, dusty, slowing at the sight of her. He pulled back the reins gently, eyes narrowing. She did not look injured, but something was broken in the way she knelt, still and hollow, like she had forgotten the world kept moving. He dismounted without a word. The woman did not turn, not even when his boots crunched on rocks behind her. Her hands were in the water, not washing, not searching, just resting there, like she needed to feel it. Matthew crouched beside her. "Ma'am," he said, voice low and careful. "You all right?" She flinched, then looked up. Her eyes were rimmed red, and her face was streaked with dried tears. "No," she whispered. "I don't think I am." He waited a beat, then held out his hand. She looked at it like it might vanish, then took it. Her fingers were cold, her grip uncertain. "I'm Matthew," he said once she was steady on her feet. "Matthew Vance. You hurt anywhere?" She shook her head. "No, just tired." He studied her. She looked no older than 22, maybe 23. Her dark brown hair was braided but coming undone, and her dress, once pale blue, was dusted and torn. Her boots were worn down to the sole. "What's your name?" he asked. "Blythe," she said, barely louder than the creek. "Blythe Verral." "All right, Blythe. You out here alone?" For a second, her face crumpled again, and she turned away. "I was with someone," she said. Then, quieter, "My brother. But he left 2 days ago. Said he'd be back by sundown. Took the last of the food and the mule." Matthew's jaw tightened. The sun was already sliding west. "That was 2 days ago?" She nodded. "You been out here since?" "I thought he'd come back." She took a shaky breath. "He said he just needed to trade something in town. He left me the tent. Said there were too many men in Calwell who didn't look kindly on women alone." Matthew glanced over her shoulder. A canvas tent was pitched crooked beneath the trees. "You got anyone else?" "No," she said. "Our parents died in Missouri. We came west after. Thought we'd try homesteading." His chest pulled tight. He'd heard that story too many times. Folks chasing land and freedom and finding only hunger and silence. "You should not be out here on your own," he said. "Not this far from town, not with nothing but a tent and creek water." "I know," she whispered. He hesitated, then said, "I can take you into Calwell. There's a boarding house. Clean bed, hot food. I cannot pay. I didn't ask for money." She looked at him then, really looked. "Why would you help me?" Matthew's voice was steady. "Because someone should." Blythe stared a moment longer, then nodded. "All right." He helped her pack what little she had. A small satchel with a comb, her mother's Bible, and a cracked tin cup. She moved slow, like every step took effort. He noticed her limp, barely there, but real. "You hurt your ankle?" he asked. "Stepped wrong last night, trying to gather firewood." He wrapped her foot in cloth from his saddlebag, tied it secure, then offered her the stirrup. She looked up at the horse, then at him. "I have never ridden with someone before." Matthew gave a small nod. "Then you will learn." He swung up first, then reached down. She hesitated, then let him pull her up behind him. Her hands rested at his sides, unsure. They rode in silence, the sun dropping lower behind them. Calwell was still an hour out when her head leaned gently against his back. By the time they reached the edge of town, dusk had settled and the sky was fading from gold to indigo. Matthew took her straight to the boarding house run by Mrs. Elkins. A stern widow who took no nonsense but knew how to spot a woman in trouble. "She stays here," Matthew said simply, handing over enough coins to cover a week. Mrs. Elkins gave him a look, then softened when she saw Blythe's face. "Room 2 upstairs," she said. "Supper's still warm." Blythe started to speak, but Matthew shook his head. "Rest first," he said. "Eat something. We will talk tomorrow." She swallowed. "You are not just leaving?" "I said I would help." She watched him for a long moment, then nodded. "Thank you." He tipped his hat and stepped back out into the night. The next morning, she was waiting on the porch when he came by. Her hair was brushed, the braid tighter. She wore a borrowed dress and clean boots. "You came back," she said. "I said I would." She smiled, small and tired, but real. They walked to the mercantile together. He bought her a pair of gloves and a new canteen. She tucked her hands behind her back, embarrassed. "I will pay you back." "You do not need to." "I want to." He looked at her. "All right then. You can tell me your story. That will be payment enough." They sat on a bench outside. She told him about Missouri, about her brother, how they had sold everything to come west. How the wagon broke down outside Calwell and they had been walking since. How her brother, Benjamin, had become harder since the journey began more desperate. "He was not always like that," she said. "He used to laugh. He used to sing to me when I was little." Matthew nodded. "Sometimes the road changes people." She looked at her hands. "I do not know if he is coming back." He was silent for a moment. Then he asked, "If he does not, what will you do?" "I do not know," she whispered. Matthew stood, held out his hand again. Blythe looked up. "What are you doing?" "Helping you rise." She took his hand slowly, and he pulled her to her feet. "I do not want to be a burden," she said. "You are not." She blinked fast, like tears were trying to come again. "Why are you doing this, Matthew?" He looked at her, steady and sure. "Because I promise you, Blythe Verral, I will not leave you out here alone. Not now. Not ever." Her breath caught, and for the first time in days her shoulders eased. He stayed. A light fog clung to the ground the next morning, thin as gauze and fading fast as the sun climbed over the hills. Blythe stood at the edge of the livery stable, watching Matthew saddle Dusty, her borrowed shawl drawn close around her shoulders. Her hair was pinned now, not braided, and her cheeks had some color again. "You sure they'll let me help?" she asked, glancing toward the back of the mercantile where Matthew had spoken with the owner earlier. He adjusted the stirrup leather and replied without looking up. "Mr. Pelton's wife just had a baby. They need someone steady at the counter while she's off her feet. You've got a clear voice and you listen close. That's enough." Blythe pressed her lips together. "I never sold goods before. Neither had Mrs. Pelton when she started," he said. "She'll show you what you need." After a beat, she said, "I'll try." That's all anyone can do. They walked together down the narrow lane between buildings, dew still on the porch rails. Blythe kept pace, her limp eased by the rest. At the mercantile, a bell chimed soft as she stepped inside. The air held the scent of flour sacks, tobacco, and soap clean and lived in. Mrs. Pelton, pale but smiling, waved her in. "You must be Blythe. Let's get you started." Matthew tipped his hat and stepped back into the street. Blythe caught his eye as he turned. "Will I see you later?" He gave a single nod. "I'll be by come sundown." She watched him go, then squared her shoulders and stepped behind the counter. By late afternoon, she'd learned to weigh dry beans and recognize the difference between blackstrap molasses and sorghum. Her hands were quick and her voice stayed calm when a rancher's wife grew impatient over the price of calico. Mrs. Pelton gave her a quiet smile between customers, and Blythe stood a little straighter each time someone thanked her. When the last customer left, Mrs. Pelton leaned on the counter with a sigh. "You've got a good head on your shoulders," she said. "If you want the work, it's yours through the week. Maybe longer." Blythe nodded once, her throat tight. "Thank you." Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying the scent of dust and distant pine. She stepped out and found Matthew waiting across the street, his hat low against the sun. Her heart lifted at the sight of him. He didn't wave, just watched her approach like he'd been waiting all day. "How'd it go?" he asked. "I didn't drop anything or miscount," she said. "Only forgot where the salt was once." "Sounds like you did fine." She shifted her satchel onto her shoulder. "Mrs. Pelton offered to keep me on." "Good." They walked without hurry toward the edge of town, past the blacksmith's forge and the shuttered schoolhouse. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the dirt road. "You always live in town?" she asked. "No. Got a place outside Calwell, about 6 miles north." She looked up at him. "You live there alone?" "Used to be my brother's land. When he passed, I kept it going." She didn't press. Instead, she asked, "You grow anything?" "Not much. Some beans. A few chickens. Mostly keep horses for the army when they come through." She was quiet for a few steps. Then, "I've never had a place that was just mine." He glanced at her, then back to the road. "Maybe someday you will." They reached the boarding house as the wind fell still. Blythe paused at the gate. "Thank you for today. You earned it yourself." She hesitated. "Will you come by tomorrow?" "I will." She nodded, then turned toward the door but stopped at the first step. "Matthew?" He looked back. "Why do you keep showing up?" He held her gaze. "Because I want to." She didn't answer, just gave a small, quiet breath and went inside. That night, she stood by the window in her room, watching the moon rise pale over the rooftops. Her hand rested lightly on the sill, and for the first time in weeks, her fingers weren't trembling. The morning after the wind settled, Blythe stood behind the mercantile counter, a pencil tucked behind her ear and a row of paper-wrapped parcels beside her. Her movements were steadier now, her hands sure as she measured out barley and folded brown paper around it like she'd been doing it for years. Her ankle was still stiff, but the weight of her steps no longer faltered. Across the street, Matthew leaned against the hitch rail outside the smithy, thumb hooked beneath his belt, watching the street bustle with the quiet rhythm of a town pulled forward by habit and necessity. A wagon rolled past, creaking beneath sacks of feed, and a boy chased a dog toward the pump well. When Blythe stepped outside with a bundle for one of the ranch wives, Matthew crossed the street. "You done for the day?" he asked. "Mrs. Pelton let me off early," she said. "Said I'd earned a rest." He nodded toward the edge of town. "Come walk with me." They left the main road behind, turning down a narrow footpath that cut between two fields just greening with spring. The grass whispered beneath their boots, and a red-winged blackbird flitted low over the fence line. "She said her sister might be coming in from Spokane," Blythe said after a while, fingers brushing a stalk of yarrow along the trail. "To help with the baby. Then maybe you'll have more time for yourself." She looked over. "What would I do with it?" "You ever work with horses?" She shook her head. "Only ever watched them from the fence. My brother always said I'd get thrown if I tried." Matthew's brow drew down slightly. "He say that often?" "Enough." Her voice didn't waver, but she looked away. "He meant well, just didn't trust the world much." He didn't press. Instead, he gestured toward the low hills ahead. "You want to learn? About horses. Would you teach me?" "If you want to." She gave a small nod. "Then yes." They walked in silence until the land opened into a narrow meadow, the fence posts leaning but holding. A pair of sorrels grazed near the far trees, tails flicking. Matthew opened the gate and led her through. "I've got a mare that's gentle," he said. "Sweet-tempered. Might suit you." He whistled low, and one of the horses lifted her head, trotted over, ears forward. She was smaller than Dusty, with a white blaze and soft brown eyes. Matthew stroked her neck, then looked to Blythe. "Here," he said, offering the lead rope. "Start with her." Blythe stepped close, one hand out. The mare nuzzled her palm, warm breath against her skin. "What's her name?" she asked. "June." Blythe smiled faintly, then whispered, "Hello, June." They spent the rest of the afternoon in the field. Matthew showed her how to lead without pulling, how to read the flick of an ear or the shift of a shoulder. Blythe watched closely, asked questions, moved with quiet care. As the sun lowered, casting gold across the grass, Matthew handed her a brush. She ran it along June's flank, slow and even. "She trusts you," he said. "I didn't think animals noticed things like that." "They do." Blythe set the brush down and turned toward him. "You always this patient?" "With horses, yes." "And with people?" He met her eyes. "When they need it." She looked down, fingers curling around the fence rail. "You're different than most men I've known." He didn't answer right away, then said, "You're different too." There was no weight in the words, just truth spoken plain. Blythe reached for the lead rope again and walked June back to the fence. When the mare was tied off, she turned toward him and said, "I've never been taught anything kindly before." Matthew's face softened. "You deserve it." The light was falling fast by then, and the wind had shifted. Blythe looked toward the hills, the sky behind them edged in rose and gray. "Will you walk me back?" she asked. He nodded and fell into step beside her. As they neared the edge of town, she said, "What made you stop at the creek that day?" "I saw you. There are plenty of folks who would have kept riding." "I'm not plenty of folks." She was quiet a moment, then said, "I'm glad you stayed." He looked over, his voice low. "So am I." They reached the boarding house gate. She paused, one hand on the latch. "I'll come again tomorrow," he said. She nodded, then did something she hadn't done yet, reached out and touched his arm, just for a second. "Good night, Matthew." "Good night, Blythe." He didn't move until she'd gone inside. Then he turned and walked toward the fading light, the sound of crickets rising behind him. A week passed, then another. The rhythm of Calwell turned steady around Blythe like a slow-moving river, never fast, but certain. She rose early now, helped open the mercantile, and spent her evenings with her sleeves rolled, sorting ledgers or sweeping the porch. Her ankle had healed enough she no longer favored it, though she still moved with care, as if expecting the world to shift beneath her. Matthew came down from the hills most days. Sometimes he brought eggs or dry kindling for the boarding house cook, sometimes a parcel of salt pork or a strip of leather for repairs. He never stayed long in town, not unless Blythe was there. One afternoon, he stepped into the mercantile carrying a small wooden crate. Blythe glanced up from the counter where she was counting tobacco tins. "What's that?" she asked, brushing her hands on her apron. He set the box down gently. "Something I found at the old place. Figured you might use it." She opened the lid. Inside were sewing notions, a pair of bone-handled scissors, spools of dyed thread, and a folded piece of fine muslin, still clean despite the years. Blythe touched the muslin carefully. "This belonged to your family?" "My mother's," he said. "She kept it tucked in a cedar chest. I thought about selling it once. Never could." Her gaze lifted to meet his. "You sure you want me to have it?" "I would not have brought it if I wasn't." She looked down again, hands still on the edge of the box. "I haven't sewn anything worth keeping since I was 16. Maybe now's the time to try again." She gave a quiet nod, then said, "Thank you." That evening, Matthew didn't ride back out. Instead, he asked Blythe if she'd walk with him past the rail yard, where the tall grass grew thick and the wind moved through it like water. She didn't hesitate. They walked in step along the dirt path beyond the last house, the scent of warm earth rising around them. Blythe carried the muslin folded beneath her arm, her fingers brushing it now and again. "I've been thinking," she said, eyes on the horizon, "about what comes next." Matthew waited. "I don't want to stay in that room forever," she said. "I want something that's mine, even if it's just a patch of garden and a place to keep rain off my head." He nodded. "That's fair. I don't want to wait for someone to give it to me either." "You don't have to," he said. "You've got a good name, a steady hand, and the town trusts you now. That's more than most folks start with." She exhaled, slow and quiet. "Would you show me your land?" Matthew looked at her, then ahead again. "Tomorrow. I'll hitch up the cart. We'll ride out." Her grip on the muslin tightened. "I'd like that." The next morning he brought the cart instead of Dusty. It was old but well kept, the boards scrubbed clean, the wheels greased. Blythe wore a borrowed hat and the cotton shawl she'd mended the night before. She climbed up beside him without hesitation. They left Calwell behind just as the sun cleared the treetops. The road curved northward, past wild plum trees and fences that leaned like tired men. Blythe didn't speak much, but her eyes stayed wide. They reached the edge of Matthew's land by midday. The house was modest, a plain wooden structure with a porch and a sod roof leaned to off the back. The chimney smoked faintly, and a chicken clucked somewhere behind the barn. Blythe stepped down and looked around. "It's quiet here." Matthew lifted down a sack of grain and rested it on the porch rail. "That's why I stayed." She walked past the porch, past the vegetable patch where dry stalks of last year's beans still clung to the poles, to the edge of a rise where the fields sloped gently east. "You work all this yourself?" she asked. "Mostly. I trade with a neighbor come harvest. He helps me bring in hay, I help him mend fence." She tilted her head. "You ever think about giving it up?" He joined her at the rise. "Thought about it, but I never could leave it. It's the only place that ever stayed the same." Blythe turned to him then, her voice low. "I haven't had a same place since I was 15. Matthew looked at her, really looked, and asked, "You want this one to be?" A slow breath left her. "I don't know what I want yet, but I know I want to keep standing here a while longer." He nodded. "You can." They stayed there until the chickens began to stir and the sun dipped behind the barn's roofline. When he drove her back, she held the muslin in her lap like something precious. Before she stepped down from the cart, she said, "If I made curtains out of this, would your windows take them?" Matthew didn't smile, but something in his face eased. "They'd hang just fine." Blythe nodded once. Then, quietly, "Then I'll sew them." He tipped his hat. "I'll be waiting." She turned toward the boarding house, her shoulders straight, the muslin tucked beneath her arm. And Matthew watched her go, knowing she'd be back. By early June, the land had warmed and the first shoots of squash pushed through the soil near Matthew's porch. Blythe had taken to riding out in the mornings after her mercantile hours were cut back. Mrs. Pelton's sister had indeed arrived, and with her help, there was room for Blythe to step away more often. She rode June now, not side saddle like Eastern women, but astride with her skirt tucked and her back straight. Matthew had built a small coupe from scrap pine, and she'd painted it a soft gray. "It's a good color," she told him, brush in hand, flecks of paint on her wrist. "It won't glare in the sun." He'd watched her work, quiet but content, the way her brow furrowed when she focused, how she tucked loose hair behind her ear without thinking. One afternoon, as they worked together to repair a cracked window frame on the north side of the house, Blythe sat back on her heels and asked, "Did you ever think about leaving Idaho?" He didn't look up from the putty he was pressing into place. "Once. after my brother died. Thought maybe I'd head to Arizona and work the cavalry horses. But I couldn't leave this place. Too many things tied to it. She nodded, gaze fixed on the sunlit ridge beyond the pasture. I thought I'd end up in Oregon. That's where Ben wanted to go. He said the rains kept the ground soft. Matthew set the putty knife down. You still want to? I don't know, she said. I think I kept walking west because I didn't know how to stop. He picked up the frame and held it firm while she lowered the glass in. Their hands brushed. She didn't pull away. That night she stayed for supper. They sat across the table from each other, the lamplight casting a golden pool across the breadboard and the worn plates. She had brought early peas and he had fried salt pork. It wasn't much, but it was warm, and neither of them left the table hungry. Afterward, he brought out a small fiddle case from the top shelf of the wardrobe. It's not much, he said, thumbing the latch open. But it still plays. You play? She asked. Not well, he admitted. I'd like to hear. So he drew the bow across the strings, coaxing out a slow waltz that wavered at first but settled into something gentle. Blythe sat with her hands folded in her lap, then stood and moved closer. I remember this tune, she said. My mother used to hum it when she sewed. He kept playing until the last note faded into the floorboards. She stepped forward then, close enough that her skirt brushed his boot. I've been thinking, she said, about staying. He didn't answer, but his eyes didn't leave hers. I like the work, she continued, voice soft. I like the quiet. And I like you. Matthew set the fiddle down carefully. You don't have to say that. I'm not saying it because I have to, she said. I've come to know the difference. He reached for her hand, calloused fingers closing gently over hers. I've wanted to ask you, he said, but I didn't want to press. You aren't. I've built this place with space for someone else. I didn't know who, not until you. She stepped closer, their foreheads nearly touching. I don't want to be someone passing through anymore. His voice was low. Then stay. She kissed him, tentative at first, then sure. His arms came around her like they knew the shape of her already. The next morning, she packed the few things she still kept at the boarding house: a comb, her mother's Bible, the muslin now sewn into 2 neat curtains, and rode out to the farm for good. Mrs. Elkins had handed her the bundle with a curt nod. You're smart to go where you're wanted, she said. Blythe had smiled and replied, Yes, ma'am, I reckon I am. By midsummer, the squash vines stretched long and green beneath the window where her curtains hung. She had claimed the small room off the kitchen and turned it into a sewing nook, where she mended shirts and pieced quilts in the golden light of late afternoon. Matthew built her a cedar chest, carved her initials into the lid, and lined it with linen. They married in the shade of the cottonwoods behind the house, just the preacher from town, Mrs. Pelton and her baby, and a neighbor who brought fresh bread wrapped in cloth. Blythe wore a dress she'd sewn herself, and Matthew had dusted off a coat that still held the scent of pine. They danced beneath the open sky, no music but the wind and the steady beat of their joined hands. Years later, folks still talked about the woman who came from nowhere and stayed. The one who rode a horse like it was part of her bones, who ran a farm as steady as any man, who stitched strength into every hem she sewed. And Matthew, who had once thought silence was all he had left, found his days filled with laughter and the soft sound of her voice in the early dark. They never left that piece of land. They built onto it instead a shed, a second coop, a garden that grew fuller each year. And when their first child was born, a daughter with her mother's quiet focus and her father's steady hands, Blythe rocked her beneath the same window where the muslin curtains still hung. The wind moved through the fields outside, and the house stood firm. Together they had built a life, not because it was easy but because it was theirs.